Everyone, it's Dawn from Extra Consortium here with the first of our primary programme revisit videos, recapping on some of the training we've done so far this year. We've decided to pick behaviour management to focus on, as it's one of those areas that trainees and teachers tend to worry about, and especially at the moment with many of you not in school at the moment. Though I'm sure your two placements have helped to embed some really useful strategies. Tomorrow in our Tuesday chat, we'll talk together about things that you've learnt in your placement. And I know that some of you as well have been revisiting the topic using our online training module. But we thought it might be really helpful to touch on some practical tips in a little video. And I'm very kindly joined by Georgie Knight from Alphington School, who you'll remember from our Twilight session on Pupil Premium a little while ago. I asked Georgie to help with this because I know from experience that she's got a great repertoire of behaviour management strategies, and we're really grateful for her to come and give up her time and share this with us today. So Georgie, I don't know if you want to sort of reintroduce yourself to everybody and a little bit about your career and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, sure, thank you. It's great to be here talking to you all again. I hope everything's going okay with your training and in the strange time we're in. So I'm coming up to the end of my 5th year of teaching. I've taught in Year 2 and Year 3 and been in other year groups during my training. I've had some different roles across the school, but this is my 3rd year as a phase leader for Year 3 and 4, which is a really, really interesting role. I've always been really interested in behaviour management ever since my training in NQT year, something I'm quite passionate about. I think because I feel it's just such a fundamental part of teaching, but it's got so many layers to it. It's about the school ethos and the systems, it's about you as an individual, the children as individuals, each class, and I've had such different classes. It's about practice and theory combined. You know, it's not just about behaviour charts and tone of voice, it encompasses so much, and I think everything you do links to behaviour. And so I just think it's a really interesting thing to talk about.
So before you share some of your tips and ideas, Georgie, and I know you've got some really good ones, I just wanted to remind the trainees of one of our first training sessions on behaviour management in the autumn term, when we had a great session with Tanya Beard from, she's the head teacher from St Martin's, and she shared their school approach to creating a positive learning environment and how an important part of this was in understanding the impact of emotional states on communication and how that challenging behaviour can often stem from a state of stress. And she talked to us about how children may have learned patterns of behaviour and how part of our role is to support them to change that. Is that something that you feel that relates to your experience and your practice and how you've managed children who struggled with behaviour in the classroom?
Yeah, I think it's such a good approach. I really like the whole child approach they have there. I think that behaviour is such a fundamental thing, like I was saying, but it's also that idea that if a child doesn't feel safe, they're not going to be able to learn. And we know that as teachers, and we think of safeguarding, but actually behaviour is part of that as well. We can help children be ready to learn, and we can help them learn to change their behaviours. The DFE in their toolkit, they say that about behaviour needing to be taught, and that's something I really agree with. We have to help them to learn what's expected of them and constantly reinforce that, because you can't expect them to just know it, and especially because actually we all try and be consistent, but every adult will have slightly different expectations. You'll have different expectations in different situations. You know, the difference between listening on the carpet in maths and outdoor learning, working together as a pair, that's different. I think it's also quite easy sometimes to overlook behaviour because you're thinking about your teaching and you're trying to make sure you're teaching in the right way and the right things, but actually, again, if that behaviour isn't there, the learning behaviours and the positive behaviours in class, then not a lot of learning is going to be able to happen anyway. I think also I really agree with the focus that Tanya puts on positivity, and that's something I try and do and didn't start doing, and then somebody pointed it out to me, and it's something I've developed over time. I think also that training sounds fantastic, but I also feel like the trainees have had some of the best training, which is just seeing other people. I think behaviour management especially is one of those things you can learn so much from seeing other people and just picking up little tips and tricks, but also just kind of absorbing the way they are with the children. And, you know, especially in your first placement, maybe your second placement, they will have been emulating their mentor and trying to make that really consistent approach. But if we do go back to school before the summer, but obviously especially in September, it will be about taking that, continuing to emulate things you've seen, but taking that and developing your own style. And I think that so to have the opportunity to see different teachers and then develop your own style must have been really good for them as well. I mean, so much of what I do is just magpied from other people.
Yeah, that's what all good teachers do. We borrow and share and
nothing's original.
No. Tanya shared with us a type of script for giving children choices, and about really putting the emphasis on the positive outcomes and positive choices. So, you know, if you choose this negative choice that you might be choosing, and obviously articulate that, then you'll be choosing this consequence. Or you could choose, and then you obviously share a positive preferred option, which is described in more detail to the children, and reiterate a positive outcome that will happen if they choose that positive choice. Is that something you do in terms of sort of scripting your language with children?
I think there's an element to it, yeah, and I think that a lot for me, what stands out for me in what she's saying there is this idea that I always come back to about making expectations very clear and helping children to constantly have them reinforced and be really clear on them, because like I was saying before, if you can't if they don't understand what's expected, you can't expect them to just know, and if they don't know, then they're not going to be able to behave in the way that you want them to. I think also offering that kind of language of choice, saying something like you know, kind of being really clear and saying, if you've made the right choice, I'm going to see you doing this in a moment, for example. That provides a lot of opportunities for positive reinforcement as well, which I think is a really beneficial thing. And it's just that, for me, it's just a really useful way of constantly reminding the children of what those expectations are, what the consequences are. You're being very explicit, and then it allows you to use that positive reinforcement to make those expectations even clearer again.
Do you think it's important how we sort of frame our talk? So if a child's doing something they shouldn't, how you phrase that, whether you ask them to stop doing that behaviour, or whether you try and frame it in a, I'd like you to do this, thank you, that emphasising the behaviour you want to see rather than the behaviour that you perhaps don't want to see. Is that something that you do as well?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's an interesting way of phrasing things that I don't know if I've massively used before, but I certainly have. I think it comes under the wider umbrella of positive behaviour management and positive reinforcement, which I realise I've said about a lot now, but it's something that I think the first time somebody mentioned it to me in some observation feedback, I didn't really know what it was, and I'm not sure I necessarily believed it could work either. And then it's once you try that, you realise how effective it is. So obviously it's things like if you, for instance, something I do is if sometimes the children know how they're expected to come in the morning, and I often get caught by parents in the morning, so sometimes I might just say to the parents, sorry, can I just have a moment, go back to the class and say, wow, so-and-so, you're reading in a really sensible way and showing me, you know, that you're really taking this opportunity to enjoy your book, or something like that. Maybe give them a house point with that really clear feedback. Then all the other children are just clicking that that's what they're supposed to be doing as well, and it's just reinforcing it. And I think that that's a really effective way to manage behaviour. And it can feel quite panicky sometimes when kind of everybody's talking, or you've sent the children to the tables to work and you've asked them to work independently and work quietly, and they're not. But actually what can be more effective than telling them not to sometimes can be to find the one child that is, and say, wow, I'm so impressed with so-and-so, they're working really, really well, they're focusing just on what they're doing, and even though it's noisy in the room, they're trying their best to be resilient and block that out. They should have 2 house points. Isn't that amazing? If it's whether it works, because some children want to receive that praise as well. Some children just need that as a gentle reminder, but it's a lot. It's a really effective way and a lot more pleasant way to say to them, "Well, you're supposed to be being quiet."
Yeah, definitely. Something we also spent a fair amount of time talking about at the beginning of the year was how we believe that the relationships with the children is so important, and building those relationships with them. Can you share a little bit about how you do that at the beginning of the year, so that you've got those relationships to help support you in managing behaviour?
Yeah, sure. It's a funny one because sometimes it happens because you see the children, you just kind of know the children that you need to put more time into building those relationships with, or maybe children that are showing more challenging behaviours. And I guess you adapt to the individual child. So that would be the first tip, would be get to know them as individuals and adapt to them. So for instance, not all children like having really public praise, and you kind of need to start learning that, because if your way of trying to build their confidence or show them that you value them is by constantly praising them publicly, but they're not that comfortable with it yet, and it's something you need to help them build up, then that might not be that effective. I think just like you would build relationships with anybody, you need to be confident, friendly, be yourself, and be kind of real and approachable. But I think also you don't have to pressurize yourself into being fun straight away. You're not trying to be their friend. You're trying to show them that you care about them and you are a consistent person that has their best interests at heart, and really convince them of that so that they begin to trust you. I think trust is that key thing there. So I think it's good to try and take some risks in your teaching and do some interesting things, but not to feel too pressured to be fun and be their friend. I think I say it a lot, but consistency is really key. I think it's key for behaviour management, but also for building those behaviours. Let them know you can trust them, that you will always be fair to them, that kind of no matter what they do, no matter how much they wind you up, you're not going to lose your temper at them. You're always going to apply the rules fairly. And I mean, obviously, it's about getting to know them. Yeah. So there's kind of 2 elements to that, I guess. You can get to know what they enjoy and have those kind of common ground to talk to them about. But again, you're not trying to be their friend. So actually, it's really good to know what their context is, what their family's like. Get to know their behaviour and their kind of maybe if they have some triggers, or get to know their strengths so you can build on them. Maybe they are really proud of being a strong speller, so you can say to them, oh, when you finish that job, maybe a job they're not currently doing, when you finish that job, could you help the other children on your table correct their spellings, please? But also it is about getting to know what they're like, because you want to show them that you care. So I think listening to them, welcoming them into the class is something that you see a lot. You see a lot of videos on Facebook and things like that of doing high fives, but I mean, I do it however you want, but I think the important thing is that you don't just do it for the sake of it. You really pay attention to them. You notice when they're coming into the class looking a bit cross, or you notice when they're coming looking excited, or you remember that they said they were going to their dad's on the weekend and you ask them how it was. It's that sort of thing. And another key thing for me is about being respectful. So like I said before, staying calm. They might really push your buttons, because we're all human and that does happen, but just trying your best to stay calm with them, listen to them where possible, and it's not them kind of disrespecting something you said. Actually listening to them if they disagree with you and they don't understand why they're maybe receiving a sanction for something, just really listen to them and then try and explain that to them and have that conversation. Again, that language of choice is very respectful towards children. You're involving them in it, and then obviously don't embarrass them and single them out. I'm sure we can all remember something that happened at school where we were told off for something, and it still kind of stays with us, and you don't always know you're doing that moment for a child. So just being aware of that. I think that's the key things.
And you've referenced already the beginning teachers toolkit, the behaviour management toolkit that I think Tom Bennett helped to develop. I was just going to sort of mention some of the key aspects of that and ask you if you've got any practical tips around it. So that within the toolkit, they outline examples of proactive behaviour management. So obviously it's that setting everything in place so that hopefully you don't have so much behaviour to manage. Can you share with us some things that you do that helps you set up those norms for what's expected in your classroom?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting take on it, and this is a really useful document just for the emphasis it puts on proactive behaviour. I think it's so important to do it from the start and then do it in all you do. And like you said, the more proactive you are, the less you're going to have to deal with later on. Like I've said before, we need to teach them about behaviour. That's part of our role. Those expectations need to be really clear and really consistent, because otherwise how will children know? And that's something that I think needs to be threaded through everything. So for me, that's what proactive behaviour management is largely about, is making expectations clear and consistent. So I think taking the time to model good behaviour, whether that's through discussion, through an explicit modelling, or children sharing their views and kind of unpicking the value of good behaviour, positive reinforcement like we've talked about. So children will pick up if you're saying every day, I'm so impressed with how you went straight to your seat without talking to others and showed me you were ready to learn. They'll pick up on that. Again, offering choices like Tanya talked about, and having clear consequences in place. I think you need to be clear with the children, clear with yourself, and also just addressing those misconceptions and poor behaviour with feedback. So don't just assume that they know that they shouldn't be doing something, because maybe actually you haven't said it enough times yet for them to know that, and maybe it's not something that they knew as an expectation before they came into your classroom. So I don't think it's that helpful to just, say to a child, you need to leave the classroom. It's important to always, again, stay calm and give that feedback and make it really clear. PSHE can be quite a useful tool for unpicking behaviour, but again, it's about giving it that time. And I know something the Toolkit talks about quite a lot, that's something I find really important, is about routines. So, for instance, in my class, at the start of the year, we practice lining up and we practice partner talk throughout the year, because that's actually quite a big one in terms of the quality of their partner talk and the quality of their learning. We practice transitions. We set up those routines and then continually embed them. It's actually, I find that the children feel a lot safer and if they know what the expectations are. But again, you need to teach them the routines and value that enough to plan the time in to do it. So for instance, my week one timetable, it's never a full week. It would involve things like an hour to give them their table spaces, because that would involve bringing them back to the carpet, discussing, how do we go to our tables? If I'm sending you off for maths, what do you think you need to get on the way to your tables? And then you're developing those independent skills as well, because they're learning that when you say certain things like, okay, it's time to go and work independently at our tables, they need to get their pencil case. But also they're learning that they shouldn't be talking to each other on the way, and how to seek support if they're not sure. So I think in your first week, it's really important to value the importance of establishing routines, take the time to do that. If you're going to assembly, 15 minutes before the assembly, allow time to talk about, what do you think I expect of you when we go to assembly? How do you think I expect you to move around the school? Should we practice that? Let's practice our lining up order so we know it really well, and lots and lots of praise around that. I think it's also really important to remember that throughout the year you'll need to reinforce that, but sometimes just more than others. So around Christmas, sometimes you just need to stop and have a little chat about, hang on a minute guys, how do we move around the classroom? It's that classroom culture. Let's just remind ourselves, sometimes when you come back after a long holiday, or maybe if you've been sick for a week and they've had a supply teacher who hopefully will have had some consistency, but it won't have been you. So yeah, we have loads of routines. And you end up with set phrases as well. So I ask them to line up, and then I will always say, don't forget, a line is when you stand one behind the other, facing the front with mouths closed. That's just, it's not, a trick, it's just what I say, because then they kind of have that checklist and they know what I expect of them. And if they're turned around facing the other way, then I can say, oh, don't forget, a line is, and then maybe I could say, wow, I'm really impressed with how Molly's facing the front. And then the one that isn't facing the front has that triggered.
Yeah.
I think linked to routines is just a general clear, calm and organised environment, which obviously a routine adds to, but it's things like children knowing where to find support if they need it, so they don't have to either disengage from what they're doing and distract others, or kind of fuss and worry about what they're doing. So maybe you could have like support areas, or we use the 5 Bs, which is simple. It's just brain, board, book, buddy, boss. And again, children being really clear of what's expected of them. Maybe you have behaviour expectations agreed on the wall or something like that. Just that idea that children feel safe and secure and they know what's expected of them.
I was going to ask you about behaviour expectations. Do you establish that in that first week as well, and do you do it with the children and talk about what would good learning look like, and maybe identify what the sanctions or rewards might be with them?
I've done different things each year, so I think it depends what opportunities you get in your school to meet your class beforehand, which obviously at this is a weird time. It's likely people won't get to meet their classes beforehand, because actually if you have a new classes day or a new classes week, it's a good opportunity to start talking about it. But yeah, I think definitely planning in some time in that first week again to set up some agreements are really helpful, but it depends what the school's doing as well. So we've recently had a whole school behaviour system introduced, so it was more reinforcing that than establishing new kind of expectations. And there was already a whole school reward and sanction system in place, so you didn't have to introduce that. And it is important when the whole school one is set up to engage with that and use that consistently, I think. And then you probably need to ask if you're going to set up your own things. I'm sure that'll be fine, but you have to kind of adapt that to your school. I think there is this thing about establishing norms though. So this isn't necessarily sitting down and discussing what's done, it's just not expecting to get an awful lot done in the first week, other than maybe a bit of assessment, something fun, and establishing the norms and establishing the expectations. So again, it's just about constantly reinforcing the high expectations, reminding them about them, maybe taking a bit of time in that first week to, for instance, if it's your first playtime, instead of going through all the rules at the beginning of the week, expect them to just understand that, kind of do it in context. So if it's your first playtime, 10 minutes before that, you could talk about what do they think you would probably expect from them at playtime, and then maybe after playtime talk about how it went. A bit more contextually, I think, is probably quite helpful.
It's just like how we break down all learning, isn't it? And you can't learn it all at once, so we chunk everything into little steps. So I can see how that would be much more effective. Yeah,
and then just keep reminding and reminding and reminding.
What are your thoughts? I know that some trainees would have worked in schools where they will have clear reward systems, and there may be concrete rewards like stickers and reward charts and other things like house points, for example, and other schools who are working more on developing intrinsic motivation. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because I think there's a place for both, and there can be quite a blurred line between both as well. I suppose, some people say, is there ever really truly intrinsic motivation because you're always doing something? But obviously there is more intrinsic rewards that we can offer. I think, like you say, your systems that you use will be related to what your school has in place, and maybe your school doesn't have anything in place, but they have an ethos around intrinsic motivation. Maybe they've got a very strong growth mindset thread running through, which obviously is about more intrinsic motivation and being reflective. I think overall, for me, it's probably important to actually not worry too much about the system itself. I think the consistency and children knowing that something is going to happen and it's going to be the same thing every time is kind of more important necessarily than what it is. I mean, you don't want them to love the sanction if you're going for a sanction to motivate them, obviously, because then it isn't demotivating. But equally, you don't want it to be something that is bringing them to tears and that they hate. I think the more important thing, though, is that they know that if this happens, and this happens, whatever kind of that is. I think you also need to adjust the sanctions you use and the rewards you use, those systems, based on your cohort. So do you have quite a young class or an older class? Obviously, even within the same year group, are they boy heavy or girl heavy? Are they what are their previous learning behaviours like? Again, what's your school ethos? I think that you probably naturally would use intrinsic motivation quite a lot when you're kind of reminding children why we behave and the value of that and the value of their actions, and having those really clear embedded expectations. I think naturally you would just keep linking that back to the value and the social norms, and that kind of is the intrinsic motivation. But I mean, if you're going to have some sort of system of extrinsic motivation, it can be helpful, but I also think it's good to do something that has a benefit as well outside of that. So for instance, I once did a token shop where you earned tokens and then you could spend them, and that was good because they liked receiving the tokens, but also it kind of helped them learn that if they about spending and saving. The rewards were things like having lunch with the teacher, reading in the morning, colouring at lunch. It was things that actually were beneficial and nice for them to do anyway, like maybe missing an assembly to read a book with a friend or something like that. So they, you could offer them chocolate, but equally a child is going to be just as excited about spending their tokens on reading a book. So I think a mixture of the two, base it on the needs of what you're doing, but you will be building that intrinsic motivation through your high expectations, I think.
What about, I know something that sometimes our trainees find difficult is the fact that you might have a child who might struggle to meet behaviour targets, but perhaps they might have specific SEND needs, or there are other reasons why it's very hard for that child, and you want to be consistent in your expectations, but sometimes there's this sense that you need to make allowances. Have you had to deal with that, and what's your sort of thoughts on it?
Yeah, that is a really tricky one. I think there's always that balance between wanting to be consistent and adapting to each child's individual needs. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think a key thing I would say is generally as a tip for NQT life, don't be afraid to seek support. So if you've got a child that's particularly challenging, it's not a weakness of yours if you've tried lots of things and you haven't quite found something that worked. You can go to the Senko and get support through that way. You could observe others just generally, which might give you some tips. You can talk it through with others, as long as you're doing that in a way that's respectful for the child. Handovers are really important. I know that, again, the situation we're in, we might not be able to do handovers with previous teachers before the summer holidays, but even if your school doesn't allocate some time for a handover, I think it's really important to talk to that previous teacher. What worked for them? What did they notice? You don't want to come with massive preconceptions, but having that prior knowledge can help. It can give you a bit of a way in.
Yeah.
I think that just because you're consistent, it doesn't mean you have to do everything the same for every child. I think when I say consistency, I mean more that you are a consistent person. So if you one day you say that somebody's not allowed to talk over you when you get to 0, that's in this class. When I get to 0, we all stop and we all listen, because I have something important to share about the learning and you value your learning, so you need to stop and listen. So if you made that expectation really clear with a focus on the learning, actually then the next day you can't just let people talk over you. It's about that consistency.
Yeah.
And I think having appropriately high expectations for each individual child. So a child might find, they might get dysregulated when they find things unfair, or they might have issues with anger or attention or something like that. But it's about having high expectations for them, and kind of, again, getting to know them, like you said, about the importance of building relationships, getting to know them so that you know exactly where those expectations can fall, and then you can be consistent with those expectations. But obviously also be adaptable. So have some children might need sensory breaks, and you need to learn to recognise when you might need to offer that sensory break. Some children might need you to check in with them really early on in your input, or they might need to be really engaged. They might need to be seated in a preferential way. Maybe they fidget less and distract others less if they're sat on a chair. Maybe they need to have preferential talk partners, and that's not about being unfair to the others. It's about putting everybody at an equal level. And you can have those discussions with the children as well. You can say, I had a big thing where all the children in my class were asking for fiddle toys and chewies and things like that. But it's about explaining to them they don't have that need, and if they had that need, they would have that provided for them. And everybody has different needs, and having something to chew on isn't one of their needs. So it's not something that will help them learn, and we only do things that will help people learn.
That's a good way of putting it. I know that some teachers and trainees will have those children who tend to seek attention, and it can be quite disruptive within a lesson, whether it's calling out or other behaviours. How do you generally deal with that?
I think it's similar to what we were saying before about things like seeking support. So for instance, I have a child in my class who I find quite challenging for that, and my TAs happen to read something and pass on to me that it can be really helpful if you give them a post-it note, and every time somebody speaks they write down their initial. And when I remember to do it, because I don't always, it does actually work really well, because he's really listening. And it's about for him, it's about encouraging him to really actively listen, because then he engages more, and then he just isn't, he isn't shouting out as much because he's more engaged in what he's doing. Sometimes again, it's about knowing each individual child's kind of capabilities. So for him, some calling out, allowing some calling out is still me having high expectations. And there was a quote in the DFE toolkit as well about needing perseverance and consistency, and it was about building relationships with challenging children. I think that's important in all of this, actually, kind of just persevering with it. And actually, if you really believe that they can adjust their behaviour to be a bit less disruptive, then help them to do that by constantly reinforcing what they need to be doing, constantly having those discussions with them, maybe having, depending on their age, a discussion with them about what would help them, because maybe they know that they find it really hard when they've been on the carpet too long, or maybe they find it really hard when they're sat near a certain child. I think this kind of thing, though, brings me to a point of how linked behaviour management and teaching are, obviously, but some of your teaching strategies will massively affect your behaviour management. So, for example, if a child doesn't understand a task because maybe the resource isn't clear enough, or you haven't left instructions on the board, or didn't explain it as clearly as you could, then the behaviour is going to be trickier. If children have been on the carpet too long, the behaviour is going to be trickier. And that's such a big thing, is, pace and carpet time and active learning. If a child is not challenged enough, or is being challenged too much because your differentiation wasn't as effective as it could have been, then the behaviour is going to be affected. So I think another really important side of it is making sure, as much as you can, they're engaged, the pace of the learning is right for them, because there will be reasons for why they're acting in a certain way, whether that's something you talk to the Senko about, having a discussion with parents. We haven't talked about parents yet. Your teaching style.
Yeah, so just going on to parents then, have you got any advice on how new or beginning teachers might involve and contact parents so that it still feels positive?
Yeah, I think it can be a really, the parent side of thing can be quite daunting. I think one of the best tips I got, I think in my NQT year, was make positive contact first. And I think the more you go, the more you realise how important that is. So maybe from your handover, you've heard that a particular parent maybe is a little bit more challenging to talk to, or has a few issues with school that might make it a trickier relationship for you to build, or maybe a child has more challenging behaviours and you're going to have to talk to the parent at some point. So just making a point of maybe just introducing yourself, finding something positive to tell the parent about that the child's done. Again, this all links back to that positive behaviour management, looking for positive things to talk about and to reference. So I think that positive first contact is great. You don't want the first time you talk to them to be to tell them that, you know, somebody got sent up to the office, and that's not a great way to start it. I think also similar things to building relationships with children: be respectful, listen to them. They you might not agree with everything they say and do, but they're that child's parent or guardian. They know a side of that child that you don't, and ultimately they will want what's best for the child like you do. And it's important to communicate that you know, yes, you're not going to tell them that. You need to be honest with them. You need to tell them what is challenging about their child's behaviour, but in a way that is respectful and shows that ultimately you care about the child and you want them to learn and you want to work as a team. And again, seek support where you need it. It can be really hard at first, especially if you're a bit younger, it can be a bit harder. And if you don't have children of your own, sometimes you can feel like you're not entitled to say things. And I think you are, because you're the trained teacher. Sometimes it can be hard when they're teachers as well, but actually usually those relationships are a bit easier. So I think positive first, be respectful, listen to them, seek support when you need it.
Great. And then, Georgie, if we is there anything else, you know, whether it's the physical environment, seating plans, anything else you remember that really helped you as an NQT when maybe you were feeling a bit anxious about behaviour management and all the things we've talked about, like routines and rules and so on? Can you give just your top tips now for us to end with?
Yes, okay, so I've said it before, I think take the time to establish routines, like you say, seating plans, lining up orders, expectations. Take the time to discuss that, to practice it. You are not a boring tyrant. If you practice lining up 10 times, they'll probably find it quite fun, especially if you say, you know, challenge them to do it even quieter, even quieter, even quieter. I think don't panic. Sometimes you can feel like you've asked them to do something and they're just not listening to you. Persevere with it. Remember how effective actually finding the one child doing the right thing and telling them they're doing that can be. You know, be prepared to bring them back and have a discussion with them. Be prepared, I think, to mix up systems you're using. For instance, when you want children to stop and listen to you, don't feel like, you know, you always have to clap, the clap and the clap back. Sometimes I do that if they're being particularly loud and I don't want to shout over them, or if I've got a sore throat. But if they're painting, it's not going to work very well clapping, because none of them will clap back. So have different strategies up your sleeve. I don't worry too much about the systems. You know, the systems don't have to be all singing or dancing. It needs to be manageable, logical, realistic. Don't promise that every child who has done anything positive that day will get a chocolate bar. You know, it needs to be realistic. Don't worry if you get anxiety dreams about every child in your class not listening to you and their teacher walking in and you haven't got any trousers on, because, you know, you will feel nervous before you start, but once you're there, they will be your class. You'll set up expectations and routines and systems together. You will work through it together. Just give it time, persevere with it, be clear, be fair, be consistent, have high expectations. I think that's my top tips.
Fabulous. That's great, Georgie. Well, I think that's given everybody lots to think about, and hopefully they'll be able to watch this back again, and when they're planning those first weeks in school, a lot of what you said I think will be really helpful to plan into those first few weeks, which are so important.
And hopefully they
brilliant.
enjoy it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I think letting the children see that you like them and that you enjoy being in school is a key part of it as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much for giving up your time. I'm going to end
Thank you. It's
the
been great
video
to talk
now,
about it.
and we'll see you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.